kind of thinking about, why we're all here. I think we're all here because we're interested in healthy eating for a strong heart beating. And I think that was a really catchy slogan. I actually found it somewhere online, so I can't claim it. But I think that really resonates on kind of why we can use food as medicine for both prevention and to help treat anything that we may have experienced in the past. And then before I get started, I should also mention that a lot of these considerations, especially when it comes to sodium, sometimes it can be important to ask your doctor first before following a strict low sodium diet, because for some people, this isn't necessarily medical advice for each individual person here, so it can be helpful to ask your doctor too. And they'll let you know if you need to not necessarily follow a low sodium diet. Kind of looking at an overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about kind of understanding what the cholesterol and triglyceride levels mean. We get back from the doctor, they take our blood, and then they give you these numbers, and sometimes we're kind of confused what that actually means. And so I'm hoping I can help interpret that for us. And then I'll talk about how our diet actually impacts those lab values and other aspects of our health in general. And because when we think about a heart-healthy diet is actually going to be helpful for our brain, it's going to be helpful for our pancreas, our liver, it's going to be healthy for a lot of variety of conditions. And I'll talk about that more later. So we'll talk about fat, carbohydrates, protein. We'll talk about dietary cholesterol and why it may or may not matter. We'll talk about alcohol a little bit. And then after that point, we'll take a break because the chili should be done, and we'll go around and give everybody some samples and get your thoughts, talk about the recipes, and then go through some of the sodium considerations and how it relates to high blood pressure and general heart health as well. And we'll talk about caffeine a little bit as well. And so when we think about cholesterol, we all hear it, we hear it all the time. What does it actually mean? And so cholesterol itself is actually what's called a sterol compound, and it's found in most, if not all, your body tissues. It comprises your cell membrane on all your muscle tissues and things like that. And so cholesterol are going to be important for also producing steroid compounds like our hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Those are all cholesterol-based hormones. And so we fundamentally do need cholesterol. It's just we don't want too much of it in our blood. And so the total cholesterol goal is less than 200 when you get that lab back. However, that's the goal that's out there as recommendations. But research now shows us that if it's less than 150, that's considered the ideal. That actually correlates with even reduced even further risk of cardiovascular disease. And then, but the total cholesterol kind of can be skewed a bit because that's not telling us the whole picture. When we think about, we've all heard that there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And so LDL is going to be considered that bad cholesterol. And what LDL stands for is low density lipoprotein. The lipoprotein portion doesn't really matter so much. It's the low density. That means it's going to have a greater surface area, and that means it's going to have higher chance of being what's called oxidized and leading to plaque formation in our arteries and things like that. And so that's part of the reason why we don't necessarily want high levels of LDL. And so our recommendations are less than 130 for the general population, and then less than 100 for people that are at risk for cardiovascular disease. And then HDL, that's going to be the good cholesterol. So on the flip side, the good news, high density, meaning a lower surface area, denser. Think small marble versus big marble. And what this HDL does for us is it helps recycle and reuse that LDL. It helps recycle that LDL back to our liver for proper metabolism and waste. And so the goal for men is greater than 50, and the goal for women is greater than 60. And you're probably thinking, why is there a difference there? Women naturally have higher levels of HDL, which has been kind of hypothesized as something that, as to reason why women tend to have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, and that may be partly to explain that, besides just making usually smarter decisions. And then, and so, really, the higher HDL, there is an upper limit to we don't want too much HDL, and your doctor will let you know, but that's very rare. But the point is we want more HDL, we want less LDL. And the total cholesterol can sometimes not be as important as those two other numbers specifically. And so next, triglycerides. What does that mean? Well, it's fat found in your blood, just little micelle, just little globules. Triglycerides are used to calculate our total cholesterol number, and so that's also part of the reason why total cholesterol won't necessarily be representative of HDL and LDL. But our goal for triglycerides is going to be less than 150. I like this slide, and I found this graphic at one point, and I liked it, so I put it in this presentation to help kind of to help visualize what's the normal artery with absolutely no plaque, and how plaque formation can actually narrow the artery and make it more difficult for blood to flow through. And that plaque, what it's actually made out of, we know it's made out of cholesterol, other fatty substances, cellular waste products, and then calcium and fibrin, which is a clotting material in our blood. And there's a side note below that. I learned this probably 3 or 4 months ago, and I thought it was important enough to include that emotional injury, stress, depression, anxiety, and negativity can increase release of inflammatory markers, and that includes one called fibrinogen, which is I can't remember off the top of my head. It's either a precursor to fibrin or vice versa, and so through that relationship, you actually may have higher levels of fibrin in your bloodstream, so you have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease if you have that negativity quite frequently. And so I thought, that just highlights the importance of emotional health as well as part of the comprehensive wellness of your lifestyle and things like that. And so getting to the dietary components, again, we'll talk about fats, we'll talk about the different types of fats, which ones we want to lean towards and the ones we want to lean away from, as well as carbohydrates, what role do they play. We'll talk about proteins, and then cholesterol and alcohol. And so dietary fats, how do those impact me? And so the first point is that fat in our diet is essential. It's actually very important for absorption of vitamins such as vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and K. And then it's also very important for our hair and skin, and pretty much all of our cell membranes as well. And so and then these other ones called essential fatty acids are actually used for proper brain function and brain development. And then we'll talk about how some of the fats can help control inflammation as well as blood clotting risks. And so the focus is not on necessarily, the focus is on the type of fat, not necessarily the amount. But the amount can be important, but the type can be even more important. And so when we talk about these types of fats, the two that we want to lean away from are going to be saturated fats and trans fats. And so the reason why, saturated fats can increase your LDL, that bad cholesterol, and your triglycerides. Both of those things are not the best things, as well as inflammation. And so those are things that we don't want. And then trans fats actually is actually so bad that the government has mandated that our food supply be free of trans fats by this summer, assuming it hasn't been delayed, which I'm pretty sure it hasn't. And when I say that, it's because it increases our bad cholesterol and it increases our triglycerides, and it also decreases our good cholesterol. So it's kind of a double negative impact right there. On the good news, we have what's called omega-3s. And so who here has heard of omega-3s? They're kind of like a trendy word. Well, more than a trend now, I think. It's pretty much established. But the reason that we hear so much about them and why they are such a good thing is that they can slightly increase both our HDL and our LDL. And so, sometimes we think, well, if it's increasing both, that can't be a good thing. And that may be, that I don't believe that's true, because I think the more HDL, that will actually help us recycle that LDL too. So it's kind of more of a neutral impact there. But it does help, and research suggests and is associated with reduced triglycerides, including reduced inflammation and reduction in any high blood pressure as well. And so those three things alone are worth the benefit of including those. And so we can talk about how they impact us as much as, till the night is over, but it's more important to know where these are actually coming from. And so as a rule of thumb, saturated fats are found in animal products and other oils that are solid at room temperature. And so that includes tropical oils like coconut and palm. I know coconut is awfully trendy these days. However, for heart health recommendations, there's not enough research there to firmly suggest that it has a definitive positive impact. So from evidence-based point, I don't feel confident in recommending actively including that additionally. But we'll have recipes there like a coconut stir fry where you just add a little bit and it really provides that flavor that you're looking for. And so there I think it's fine. And then other solid fats include, like the marbling on a ribeye, margarine, butter, and then packaged goods like cookies, pastries that have butter and other fat products included for like mouthfeel and shelf life. And dairy is also an animal product that's solid at room temperature, or mainly cheeses. And then you think whole milk, you think whole milk cheese, or cheese and yogurt. But research is actually showing that dairy is actually a little bit different, because so much of research in nutrition tries to identify a single nutrient that is causing all of our problems, when really we need to be looking at the food choices, at the whole food choices that we're choosing, and how that's actually impacting everything. And so when you look at when dairy specifically is included in a diet as a saturated fat, it's actually more of a neutral fat, not necessarily harmful, not necessarily beneficial. And part of that, to explain that a little bit, is that it includes calcium, and then it has some good protein there for us, but mainly the calcium, because we know that calcium provides a heart healthy protective benefit actually. And it can be useful for blood pressure control as well. And then trans fats, these are, again, those ones that should be out of our food supply by this summer. And the sneaky thing about these is that on the food labels, they're legally required to have that on the food label, but if the serving size is less than 0.5 gram per serving, they can put 0 trans fats on their label. So they're kind of hiding it, even though it's still in that food. And so it's important to look at the ingredients list on things like margarine. Crisco was, I think, the original one way back in the 30s or so. And then some mainly baked products as well, or mainly baked products really, in the center aisles, and then as well as sometimes, even at the Hy-Vee bakery, they can sometimes have some trans fats in there that we may not know about. And the way to identify that is to look at the ingredients list and look for this word, or these words, partially hydrogenated oils. Those are the oils themselves that are considered trans fats, and so that's where you can look to find that out. And so thankfully, we shouldn't have to worry about that moving forward after the summer, but we do need to still be mindful and cautious to think about what will they come up with next, And so I always say, stick to what we do know, not what we don't know. And by the end of the presentation, I hope we have a clear picture on what we do know. So the question was, where do oils come in when I'm trying to make a heart-healthy choice? And so the 2 oils that I typically recommend the most are canola oil and olive oil. And that's because each oil actually has their own unique, what's called fatty acid profiles of different types of fats with each oil. They're not all 100% pure saturated fat, 100% pure trans fat, and et cetera. They all have unique profiles, and olive oil and canola oil have the most beneficial ones from what I understand. Omega-3 fatty acids, we kind of mentioned them before, and so research really does suggest that the more we learn about omega-3s, the more favorable they look to overall health. So they're beneficial for heart disease and other conditions in general health. Again, they reduce triglycerides and inflammation. However, they do potentially increase both HDL and LDL, but I do think that the benefit is outweighed there. And so the goal is to eat fish. Fish is the #1 source of omega-3s. And research does suggest that getting your omega-3s from fish is going to be more beneficial than taking a supplement. And that can be due to other, when you kind of think about research, they try to isolate a single food or supplement, and you got to look at the whole diet as well. And so it may be that people that eat salmon and fatty fish more routinely just have more heart-healthy lifestyle practices in general anyway. And so they can be skewed there. But the goal is eating fish routinely, so at least 2 times per week. And so a serving is about the size of your palm, and that's going to be about 4 ounces of fish there. And so that can reduce your risk of heart disease and all-cause mortality. That's actually how confident they are in fish intake. And when I say fish, I'm mainly, I forgot I had a pointer. I'm mainly talking about, you can't really see it that well, but mainly talking about tuna, salmon, sardines, king mackerel. But then when it comes to fresh fish and salmon, we do want to choose like the Pacific wild-caught salmon versus the Atlantic farmed salmon, and that's because the farming, it can be, from what I understand, is the farmed fish can sometimes be, I guess, raised and harvested, for lack of a better word, in kind of unsanitary conditions, and then they just don't have that fatty acid that as much omega-3s compared to that wild sockeye salmon that they get from Alaska, like Hy-Vee does sometimes. When it comes omega-3 eggs, we'll talk about eggs a little bit later, but how they actually get omega-3 eggs is they go ahead and feed the hens either flaxseed or just a high omega-3 feed, and that the hens are so good at really putting that nutrition in the eggs for us that you actually get a lot of that omega-3 in the egg itself. And where you find it in the egg is actually going to be that yolk. And so we'll talk about why, we may actually want to go ahead and eat the whole egg after being told, so many decades now to avoid eggs. And so we'll talk about that. And then for plant sources of omega-3s, we got walnuts in particular. I'm a fan of any nut or seed. They have benefits across the board. Some are slightly better than others, but walnuts have the most omega-3s when it comes to nuts and seeds, or nuts. And then flaxseed and chia seeds are going to be good sources of omega-3s as well. And you'll notice on here it says ground/milled. And the reason I say that, and the reason I recommend those versions of the seeds, or if you want to do it yourself, we don't have the enzymes that actually break through the seeds, and so we're not able to actually get in there and get the omega-3s to actually benefit us. We still get the benefit of the fiber. Will help us stay regular, particularly flax seeds. But you may be missing out on some of the additional benefits there from inside the seed. And so talking about fish oil and the supplements, what the research shows. And so like I mentioned, it is best to eat the fish. The fish oils supplements have still been shown to be effective for lowering triglycerides, as much as 20 to 50%, research suggests. And so, and the supplements can also help reduce your blood pressure in people with high blood pressure. And evidence is suggestive for doses up to 2 to 4 grams per day. And that's actually a pretty large dosage of fish oil. And so, notice the next point is to always ask your provider or your doctor before starting a supplement, because fish oil is actually also a natural blood thinner. And so if you're on any blood thinning medications, it can have some, not so favorable impacts there. And so you want to avoid those drug interactions and then other safety concerns that may be relevant. And on that same note, vitamin E and a high dose garlic, so like supplements of garlic, if you're eating garlic in your diet, most people probably wouldn't reach a concerning amount, but those are also natural blood thinners. So just to be mindful if we're taking a supplement with vitamin E or a large dose of garlic, to consider asking your doctor if that's an appropriate option, just to avoid any safety concerns. And then the idea is kind of too much of a good thing. Moderation is still important. And this slide is is a busy slide, violates all the presenting rules there are out there. But I took the slide out and then I thought, well, I'm going to put it back in, because this slide actually really highlights kind of the impact of food choices and how they can actually really help us. And so when we're looking at walnuts specifically, it says when they're added to a low-fat diet, total cholesterol may be decreased by 4 to 12%, and low-density lipoprotein, that bad cholesterol, may be decreased by 8 to 16%. And so that may not sound like much, but if our total cholesterol is 200, that 12% could potentially be 24 points dropped. And so that's, pretty significant, I would say. And then it's also associated with improvements in high density, the good cholesterol, as well as, or it's associated with improvements in the good cholesterol in patients with type 2 diabetes. And then when it comes to flax seeds, when we're consuming about 2 tablespoons per day is about that serving size there. Total cholesterol can be decreased by 5 to 15%, and LDL, the bad cholesterol, can be reduced by 8 to 18%. And then flaxseed can also be helpful for if we're experiencing constipation. It can help us stay regular as well, as long as we're consuming enough fluids. And so carbohydrates, how do they impact me? And so when it comes to carbohydrates, and especially some of the trendy diets out there now, thinking, paleo diet, ketogenic diet, they're all low carbohydrate. Well, I won't get too into that, but when it comes to carbohydrates, we fundamentally need those for energy. Glucose, which is the simplest form of carbohydrates among a couple other ones, is actually the only source of energy for our brain, unless we're starving. And so we obviously don't want to get to that point. But that just highlights one of the reasons why carbohydrates are essential for our body. And that's why, when we have low blood sugar, we feel, fatigued, we get lightheaded, we just feel foggy. And that's because we don't have the energy for our brain to work properly. The problem is when the problem can occur when our diet includes too many simple sugars, for lack of a better word, because those simple sugars they can increase our high triglycerides. And then if blood sugar control is another consideration, they're not really doing us any favors there as well. And so when I say simple sugars, I'm referring to kind of the refined white breads versus the whole grain, heartier breads, white pasta, white rice, and then potatoes. Potatoes kind of get a bad rap because they're actually one of the most filling and satisfying foods out there. And they are nutrient rich, actually. They have plenty of potassium, plenty of vitamin C. And so overall, for the simple sugar category, I think potatoes probably get the worst rap. But also included are sugar-sweetened beverages, including soda and juice. And so the better choices are going to be the 100% whole wheat grain, like pasta, breads, brown rice, quinoa, and then barley and oatmeal especially are going to be 2 of the really heart-healthy options. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then fruits and vegetables, of course, in general, are going to be great options. And so the question was, how good is diet soda compared to regular soda? And so, I'm just not really a big fan of either, to be honest. Some of those artificially sweetened products can kind of cause us some or some stomach and GI distress. And so, namely like bloating for certain sugars, certain artificial sugars. But when it comes to my recommendations, I would recommend one that was stevia sweetened. That's the sweetener that I feel most comfortable recommending. Stevia. It's derived from a leaf, this stevia leaf. And so it's considered a natural sweetener, so it's not actually classified as an artificial sweetener. But it can take some time to get adjusted to, because it has a pretty iconic aftertaste to it. And the ideal scenario is that if we're used to drinking soda, regardless of what kind, to kind of slowly tread towards the unsweetened beverages in general, because if we're still drinking the diet sodas, even though they might not be impacting our blood sugar quite as much as regular sodas, just as one example, we'll still be used to expecting that sweet flavor. And so, the goal is to reduce those fake sugars flavors and including more of those natural from fruits and things like that as well. However, on that note, juice, you may be asking, well, juice, if it's 100% juice, that can be straight from the fruit. But in my opinion, juice is basically just the sugar pressed out of the fruit, and then they left all the good stuff like the fiber, and then they have to refortify some of the nutrients based on the process. If it's heated, they can lose some of the vitamins from it, and they have to refortify it. And so I always say, if you like orange juice, go ahead and have the orange instead. if that would be a possibility. So whole grains and fiber in general, how do those play a role? So both, mainly the fiber can help slow down our absorption of sugars when we're eating meals, and they can actually, depending on the type of fiber, can help reduce our cholesterol levels. And so when it comes to types of fibers, there's two main categories, insoluble and soluble. And a soluble fiber, why it's called soluble is that it's soluble in water. And so when you think about, and the biggest example is going to be oatmeal as well as beans. It says legumes, but legumes is just a fancy term for like black beans and kidney beans. When you're cooking those, it's really absorbing a lot of water. If like you take half a cup of oatmeal, turns into a cup or half a cup of dried oatmeal becomes like a cup of cooked oatmeal after the water is used to cook it, or milk or what have you. And the good news with that is that that soluble fiber binds to compounds that would otherwise help you absorb fat and cholesterol. And so less is absorbed, and so your cholesterol levels may drop. And then insoluble fiber, thinking most fruits and vegetables, kind of thinking the outer, like you think of celery, it's very, fibrous. And so that's the type of fiber that gives it really that crunch. That helps promote feelings of fullness with meals, so you're going to be more satisfied with a smaller meal potentially. And then that's going to also help with your regularities with bowels, assuming you have plenty of water. Because when it comes to when our bowels are a little backed up, we always hear fiber, fiber, fiber. But if we don't include fluids, we may just be contributing to the problem actually. And so we got to make sure there's plenty of water there to help things move along. And in this slide, I just took this quote from kind of what's called a meta-analysis, and it just highlights how including foods high in fiber, such as oat bran, reduces the risk of heart disease and death from cardiovascular disease when consumed as part of a diet low in saturated fat. And so, there is evidence to suggest that all these changes are worth doing. And so protein, the gist of it, or for which sources are best, the gist is not necessarily where it's coming from, but the fat that's accompanied with it. So when we think about the choices we'd rather step away from, we're thinking ribeyes, fried meats, the chicken with skin on, cream. Well, when it comes to cream, that's again a dairy consideration that may not be as harmful as people thought. So a better choice for, say, ribeye would be a sirloin. A better choice than a fatty pork chop would be a leaner pork chop. And then, of course, instead of fried, having baked, sautéed, grilled, all those options can be great as well. And then, although deli meats are leaner meats, they're you still got to be cautious with deli meats because they're going to be really high in sodium. And the American Institute of Cancer Research has also has associated deli meat intake with increased risk of certain cancers, such as colorectal and I want to say prostate. I'd have to double check those before I give you before I can be confident in that though. And then there are also plant sources of protein as well, such as edamame. Has anybody heard of edamame before? It's basically just a fancy term for a young soybean variety. Quinoa, beans with brown rice, kind of complementing those proteins. If you're vegetarian, that's only when I would be concerned about really talking about complementing proteins. Otherwise, you should be getting enough high-quality protein from animal products as a general basis. And so, dietary cholesterol, why does it matter? And so this is where the eggs come in. And so, dietary cholesterol is cholesterol that's found in foods. And so, the thing that people have found out now, researchers, that it's not the same, it's not treated the same, it doesn't necessarily directly impact the amount of cholesterol that's in our blood. And so there actually are no longer any recommendations for limitations on cholesterol, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend going out and having 8 eggs a day or something, just because I'm pretty sure that probably hasn't been studied, but maybe it has. But they're basically saying that there's no real concern on necessarily limiting your amount. It's just the focus is on that wide variety of food, of healthful foods in general. Because thinking about fruits and vegetables, I always say we want to taste the rainbow. Get those color varieties. And taste the rainbow, but not talking about Skittles. Because that might not be exactly the right way we want to be going. But the reason they were concerned, or the reason why we're not concerned with cholesterol from the diet necessarily, there's going to be a very small portion of the population that does really respond to a low dietary cholesterol diet. However, there's no sense in limiting or purposely limiting your dietary cholesterol unless you've already tried just making more heart-healthy approaches around the board, because otherwise you may be unnecessarily be restricting and depriving yourself of some of your favorite foods when really you don't need to. If there is a concern, the main sources are going to be shrimp, eggs, and baked goods. And baked goods because they contain eggs if a lot of baked goods include eggs. And so, and a short blurb on alcoholic beverages. Alcoholic beverages can lower your good cholesterol, and it can raise your triglycerides, both of those things we don't want. And so the recommendations is that if you don't drink now, it's not recommended to start for any perceived benefit, just because of the risk of alcohol-related complications or dependencies and things like that. And then, but as a general recommendation for women, less than 1 serving per day, and for women, 2 or less, or 1 or less servings per day, and men 2 or less servings per day. And the reason that there's a difference there is because men tend to have more muscle mass, so they're more able to metabolize it more efficiently. And so, as standard drinks, 12-ounce light beer, 7-ounce liquor or heavy beer, and then 5-ounce wine as a general. And so the summary so far, we want to choose more lean proteins, choose more fatty fish and omega-3 sources, choose more oils like canola and olive oil. We want to choose more whole grains, especially oatmeal and barley. Those are 2 really high sources of soluble fiber, as well as kidney beans and black beans and any legume really. And then choose more fruits and vegetables as a whole. And then again, if you don't drink alcohol, or if you do drink alcohol, do so within recommendations. And so you'll notice that I'm highlighting what we want to include more of, not necessarily what we want to include less of, because if we're thinking about what we should be limiting, that really provides kind of a negative concept to our eating habits. And I think we should all be enjoying what we're eating. And so I think that that's been lost in messages in the past years where people have been talking about limiting this, depriving yourself. And, I always think that, if it's not a positive experience, it's not going to be sustainable and it's not going to be successful. And so I think that's the real key really to any lifestyle change, because behavior change in general is hard, and your eating habits is part of your behavior. And so with anything, change takes time as well. It doesn't necessarily talk about high blood pressure and hypertension specifically. We're talking about sodium, and then I have a slide on caffeine as well. But when we talk about sodium, how does it impact me? And so basically, a high sodium diet directly raises your high blood pressure just based on the metabolism of sodium and its interactions with our blood. And so it's going to have a negative impact on if we do have high blood pressure, it's going to have a negative impact on our blood vessels and our organ functions, because when we think about where our blood goes where our blood flows. And so if we have increased blood pressure, we're placing increased stress on our organs and other tissues in our body. And sometimes that's not necessarily obvious. You wouldn't think of that. You wouldn't necessarily think that. It's not necessarily the best for your heart, but you wouldn't necessarily immediately think, oh, that's not good for my kidney. That might not be good for my liver and other organs. And so a low sodium diet can provide benefit to any heart risks and other conditions. And so the goal, they say for a low sodium diet, is 2,000 milligrams per day. And so that really highlights how if a regular serving of chili is 616 milligrams per serving, and we're not just keeping it at 1 serving, we could potentially almost be at half our daily goal already. And so that's why the comparison to the chili of just 347, that allows a lot more flexibility with that meal. When it comes to general population recommendation, the goal is 2,400 milligrams. And so really, considering the standard American diet is estimated at 300 or 3,600 or more milligrams per day, if you're able to reach that 2,400, I'd say you're doing a heck of a job, because I know certain days I don't stay in that guideline. I sometimes slip up unintentionally. And so really I think the goal again is going to be just following a general healthful diet across the board, and you'll naturally stay within those recommendations. What's really going to impact that daily amount that you're having are going to be from, as far as studies show, salty 6 is what they're called. There's 6 popular foods that can add high levels of sodium to your diet. And so those include breads and rolls that, that may be kind of surprising. You wouldn't necessarily think that either because it doesn't taste salty. Breads and rolls, when you think about how they're made, you're using baking powder, baking soda, and salt, among other ingredients potentially if you're buying them commercially. And all those ingredients contain sodium, and so it can be helpful to just take a second glance at the bread that you usually buy, and you can compare it to the bread right beside it at the marketplace and seeing if it's a better option there. And again, I would include 100% whole grain or some other sort of whole grain or whole wheat or another whole grain. And cold cuts or cured meats, so thinking anything from bologna, sausage, bacon, and then even deli turkey, deli ham. Those are all going to be like really high sources of sodium just based on that process of ensuring that it's a safe food to eat. Because when it comes to those meats, it's really just a safety concern based on how they used to make those meats originally, when we used to not have refrigeration and things like that. However, that doesn't necessarily give us as many benefits as it did then because now we have better options. And so my typical recommendation is to lean away from those processed meats like that. And next is pizza. And when you think about it, you're going to have the bread, potentially salty, the sauce, potentially salty, the cheese, potentially salty, and then if any deli meats on there. And so it's kind of a combination of four different things that can really add up quickly. And so, if you're absolutely dead set on having pizza for a meal, I'd recommend trying homemade. You might find that it's more fun than you thought it would be, and you have more control, of course. And then my other recommendation would be if you're dead set on having some that you're not making, just be more mindful of the portion size. And if you're not eating all of it now, you'll have some more for later. And poultry's not obvious, but the reason poultry's on there is because if we go to the meat counter and we see a particularly plump chicken breast, sometimes the reason behind that is that they injected a saline solution, and what that does is help make it more fresh, help make it look more fresh. And but the reason, or the way you can tell if that's kind of the one you chose, is if you go home and you cook it on the skillet without adding salt to it and things like that. You can cook it, and if water kind of drains out of it, that can be a sign that it was injected with some sort of solution. And then also if you're just cooking it by itself and it just tastes salty, that's a pretty obvious sign that they added something to it. And then of course soup. We think soups or any canned good, notably salty, again for food safety concerns. But the good news is that you can find low sodium options. And I say low sodium, not reduced sodium, because the reduced sodium, they kind of try to trick you there. Reduced sodium only has to be 25% less sodium than that company's original product. So if you have a soup, one whole can, so usually 2 servings is 1,500 milligrams of sodium. If it's just reduced, it only has to be at roughly 1,100 milligrams to be considered reduced sodium. That's still a lot. Low sodium has to be less than 140 per serving. That's a dramatic difference that can really pay dividends to your heart health. And then sandwiches, because it has the bread and then the deli meat potentially, and then cheeses can also. So it's kind of like the pizza, just without the sauce. Before I forget, table salt. It's not recommended to add salt. Ideally not when cooking, but sometimes you do need to add a little salt when cooking. But certainly not at the table, because just 1 teaspoon of sodium equals 2,300 milligrams. So when a teaspoon is maybe your half of your thumb, and so if you add just that much, you're already at your daily recommended amount. And so if you're able to cut that out or gradually reduce over time, because our taste buds don't change overnight, we all know that. But what we do know is that our taste buds do change over time. And so a lot of people may not be aware that the Lay's company actually has, not publicly presenting this, but they've been gradually reducing their sodium in their chips to help meet some guidelines that have been set, or to help meet really the school requirements that they've been having, because a lot of kids still want chips with their lunch at high school, hopefully just at high school. And so to help meet those guidelines, they've reduced their formulation of sodium. And as far as I'm concerned, I haven't heard any complaints. And so it's just over time we do They say if we're consistently reducing our sodium, usually 3 to 4 weeks can sometimes just be all it takes to get used to a lower sodium. And then with frozen foods, I'm a big fan of frozen produce actually. If it's out of season, I always say shop seasonally in the fresh department, but if it's out of season, you're reducing, if it's out of season and it's still in the fresh department, it's gonna have to have been imported or something from, X miles away. And so, but if it's a certain, if it's frozen and it's available in frozen, they freeze that pretty much as quickly as possible after harvest, and it really helps retain that nutrition quality and helps any degradation of nutrients. And then, but when it comes to frozen vegetables, notably, I do recommend those without the sauces, because they usually don't really have that good of ingredients in that sauce, and they usually don't taste good either, at least in my experiences. And so if you're able to make it at home, that's great and ideal. And then condiments can be tricky as well, especially with sweet condiments like ketchup and barbecue sauce. We don't taste that saltiness necessarily. Sometimes we just taste the sweetness, but they can be sometimes hidden sources of sodium as well. So again, taking a second glance at the label can be helpful there. And then, so tips to reduce sodium, always read the labels. A 5-second glance can really save you a lot, especially if it's like a loaf of bread and, there's 20 slices in there. And so, or on average maybe. And so, if you're able to find one that has, up to 100 milligrams less, you're really cutting down on sodium over time. And so, and as well, choose, or do not add salt at meals or when cooking, ideally, although there is some more leniency with cooking, especially when it's diluted throughout the entire recipe that you're making. And then try spices and herbs. If there's one that you've never tried before and you're like, oh, I wonder what that tastes like, feel free to go ahead and maybe add it. The worst thing that can happen is you don't like it, and so you'll know not to use it again. And so, but the best thing that could happen is you found your new favorite herb that you just never had before, and you're like, how did I live with this without my whole life? Look for the low sodium on packages, and then opt for the fresh goods, including fresh produce and fresh vegetables and things like that. And then this is just kind of a slide that I chose to include about caffeinated drinks. There is a general population recommendation of 300 to 400 milligrams per day. That's dandy, but if we don't know what that looks like, it's not very helpful. Basically, follow your doctor's recommendations. If they recommend that you avoid caffeine, certainly do so, because it can increase your heart rate and blood pressure more immediately, not necessarily long term, as far as I understand. And then, but what 300 to 400 milligrams looks like is basically 3 to 4 cups of coffee. So that's actually quite a bit of coffee sometimes. And then when it comes to black tea is about 60 to 90 milligrams per cup. Green tea is about 30 to 45 milligrams. And decaf actually does include a little bit, 10 to 20. Not too much, but still a little bit. And then when it comes to herbal tea is 0 milligrams unless specified otherwise. And then there actually is a federal limit to the caffeine that can be included in cola beverages, which I thought was interesting. Only 71 milligrams per can of soda at 12 ounces. So really a cup of coffee has up to roughly 30% more caffeine than a can of soda. Granted, I'm not recommending that you choose soda over coffee, because coffee is actually the #1 source of antioxidants in the standard American diet. And the reason why primarily is because most people don't choose diets rich in fruits and vegetables. And so that's why coffee can be the #1 source. Within that population recommendation, I might add, there's actually some research that looks at how caffeine impacts our cardiovascular disease risk based on how we respond to caffeine. And so the research suggests that if you're what's called a fast metabolizer, meaning you're one of those people that can have a shot of espresso right before you go to bed and have perfect sleep, then that means you're able to metabolize it well, and you're at reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's a good thing. But if you find that you're one that gets really jittery just from half a cup of decaf, then it may not be. You're actually at increased risk from what research shows. And it's interesting, they're actually starting to try to identify that based on our genetics, and they're trying to do that now. And so that's the future as far as I'm concerned. Personalized nutrition based on your genetics. Exciting stuff. Although I'm not familiar enough to really be too excited. So that's just an extra fun little bonus. So dark chocolate, if you're going to choose chocolate, dark is going to be more beneficial. And the reason behind that, it has flavonoids in it, which help stimulate the formation of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide increases vasodilation. That's just a fancy term for it increases the circumference of your blood vessels. So you're able it actually it increases your blood pressure a little bit, but it helps reduce your endothelial dysfunction, which basically just means it's helpful for it's beneficial for your arteries. However, like I said, dark chocolate is going to be more beneficial than milk chocolate because milk chocolate has more sugar in it than chocolate or than cocoa, and then cocoa powder, of course, is going to be a great source as well. And green tea may help reduce risk of high blood pressure, and I put it's a much better choice than soda, and so it can be one of those transitional tools if you're trying to cut down on soda, and it can be a good way to have some flavor, whether or not you like it. Sometimes it is an acquired taste. And then calcium and magnesium might also have a role in reducing blood pressure. It's all, again, I always ask that you ask your provider or doctor before taking any supplements. But calcium can be, and another reason to take them together actually is that calcium can be constipating and magnesium can do the opposite. And so some practitioners like to combine them to help maintain normal bowel movements. But then a summary of the entire presentation, that's a lot of words. But again, kind of the first portion, include more lean, fresh, low sodium proteins, more fatty fish like tuna, salmon, mackerel, more high omega-3 plant sources like walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, more fruits and vegetables with variety important, taste the rainbow again, and more dairy products in general to not worry about them so much. Like when it comes to, and I'll scratch that, more whole grains like the 100% varieties, and then more no added salt, low sodium canned and convenience goods. Reading labels is important, and then choosing more oils versus those solid fats usually. And then there's a little tiny excerpt on the bottom of less high fat, full fat dairy. Full fat dairy I forgot to take out, but less luncheon meats, of course, and less soda, less juice, and less high sodium foods and refined foods basically. And so that is my presentation.